The answer to why we're seeing more of this push for this ideology than ever before, I think is really quite simple. And it's because we've ejected God from both the public realm and also from the hearts of people. And there's a vacuum that occurs when this happens. One of the big issues that I think we're seeing is that people have taken and deified human feelings and the personal will. And they believe that this is the be-all and end-all of what truth is. This is where we get that idea of my truth versus the truth, your truth versus the truth. What we need to do is take a big step back and realize that our personal desires and our personal feelings are much more influenced by various things around us and within us than we really give credit to. We have passions within us that we are often unaware of, that are very much controlling our thoughts and our feelings. We have ideological movements around us and people with really dark agendas who are pushing these things. We have that ideology influencing entertainment, movies, television, music. We have it influencing education. We have it influencing essentially the way that people think. And we often think that, again, our desires and our feelings are the be-all and end-all, but we don't recognize that those desires and feelings were very much formed by what's happening around us and, again, within us. And until we can have a much more dispassionate view of those things, until we can take a step back and look more soberly, and beyond that, we have to know that with that sober look, you will never be able to look at everything objectively. There's no true objective view on these things. So then you have to ask, well, then which view is most worthwhile? And the view that's most worthwhile is that which sees through the eyes of our Creator. This is why St. Paul's saying, take every thought captive is such a powerful, it's such a powerful idea. We need to be able to make sure that the perspective that we're looking at is the same perspective as that of our Creator, because the Creator can't be wrong, but the creation can be wrong, and we're wrong in many, many different ways. So when you take all that into account, we realize that having the proper perspective on this takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of seriousness. And we have become exceedingly unserious about very serious issues. It's a horrifying thing. We're so unserious. One of the best books on the issue of transgenderism that I've read, I've only read a couple so far, there's more I want to read, but the best book I've read so far is Ryan Anderson's When Harry Became Sally. I wasn't a huge fan of the title. I thought the title sounded a bit polemical, but the content was not. The content was incredible. The complaints about this book caused Amazon to remove it from their website. So if people want to read this book, they have to find it in a source other than Amazon. But when you read the book, you sit there and wonder, why would you remove this? It's full of well-researched facts that simply warn people about what this movement is really about. And what he documents is the fact that much of the medical field has been driven not by medically and science-based work, but by ideology, such that not even those who are pushing against the agenda, but simply those who have done studies in which they simply delineate what questions have been asked and studied and which ones have not. When they look at this and simply say, well, we've drawn a lot of conclusions that actually don't have science yet to back it up. Those people have been thoroughly, viciously attacked. Some of them have managed to almost miraculously keep their jobs, but many of them have been essentially blacklisted in the scientific world because the scientific world is no longer really scientific. So there are ideologies and there are movements pushing these things that we would argue are really just heresy. Why? Well, because heresy just means of a different opinion, and a different opinion than God. And St. Paul tells us that heresy really begins in the pits of hell. So these are all rather demonic movements. That doesn't mean everybody swept up in these movements is a willing participant with demons. I want to make that really clear. Some people are absolute victims of this sweeping them up. and telling them that this is the answer to all their problems. And yet, all the information that says otherwise, for instance, the massive amount of people who are detransitioning, the fact that if you don't begin hormone therapy, 80 to 90% of children who believe they're transgender end up renouncing that view later on in life. Whereas if you begin hormone therapy, the vast majority of them continue to believe that they're transgender. It shows you that these things are being influenced. But we suppress all this. We suppress the people who have detransitioned. We suppress the true numbers of suicidality that continues on even after this. We suppress the fact that transgenderism is largely connected with multiple comorbidities. We suppress the fact that much of the those affected by the transgender ideology also have autism. We suppress these things because we want to normalize all of it. And people don't realize that these forces are actually twisting the reality and trying to pull you in. So there are many people who are not willing participants, but are really victims of this. Getting to the bigger issue of identity. This is still something I'm thinking a lot about. So this is kind of a thought experiment and process that I'm still trying to figure out. But I think when it comes to identity, I try to describe it as three circles, with the most central one being our truest identity. But within that circle is God. And it's necessary that Christ is there because we're made within the image of God. You can't know the copy without knowing the prototype. You have to know the one after whom we were created in order to really understand who we are, which means true identity doesn't come from us. True identity is given by God because He created us. It's the Creator who we go to really learn. So which means the practicality of this is that if we are to know ourselves, we must first know God. And this is why self-knowledge is really difficult. Now, the circle outside of that would be the things that I think become a deep part of our identity or are connected to that center circle. But they are things that maybe we can choose in some sense. Some things we can't. We can't choose our sex, our gender, which are really the same thing. So being male would be part of that. But I would also say that when I became a married man, being a husband became part of that circle. Being a father of children became part of that. And when I became a priest, I think it became part of that circle. And then the third circle on the outside of that are just simple preferences, likes, dislikes, things that are pretty fleeting and can change with time. I happen to really like hockey. I don't so much like basketball. That would be on that third circle. What happens when we take that central circle and we remove it? Suddenly everything else comes crashing in one more, and we put God on the outside. Now we have disordered identity, and we say that those things that are now the center, including me being male, well, within that is my will. And so therefore, if I'm going to have true autonomy, I can change those things. And why is God on the outside? Because that's a mere choice. If you want to believe in God, go for it. If you don't worry about it. And suddenly now we've made the human will our own God. We made desire our own God. We made feelings our own God. But how fleeting are these things? In a single day, I can be completely energized and elated 1 minute and then depressed 5 minutes later. And sometimes I look at that and go, I don't even know what changed. I don't know what happened that took me from this high to this low, and I can be everything in between throughout the day. We shouldn't trust these things. And again, within that center circle, we don't realize that we're actually being very much influenced. The way that we speak and the way that we think are very much influenced by outside sources. So I think until we really take a step back and examine what identity really is, and examine the fact that can we really know ourselves outside of the Creator, which we can't, that we're always going to have confusion in these areas. And we don't want to be led by confusion. Right now, confusion is not just leading us, confusion is being encouraged by many people in charge. Confusion is being thrust upon us as if it's a good thing. And then as people begin to lament in their confusion, those voices from the outside say, this is the answer. And they give us this false answer that ends up just destroying more and more people. And if it destroys 99 people, but they can find one supposed success story, they lift up that success story and everyone applauds. And they say, well, this is true bravery, this is true courage. It's a very odd thing in society, by the way, that those who are being applauded the most are said to be the most courageous, whereas those who are speaking up and being attacked on every side are not being applauded for having courage. This is not how courage works. This is not how bravery works. We need to be much more concerned about the view of God. And we need to recognize that in 2,000 years of Christian history, it's those who have sought the will of God first who seem to be at the most peace within themselves. And this is why I'm always talking about the Orthodox Christians who have come out of the gulags, because you would expect, take my very favorite video, my absolute favorite video on YouTube, is a 2-minute clip of this priest named Father Roman Braga, B-R-A-G-A. It's called God is Not in the Books. In God is Not in the Books, he describes the fact that as a Romanian priest monk, he was imprisoned by the communists. He was beaten, tortured, and he was put in solitary confinement for nearly 3 years. Eventually, he was released and he was exiled. And he went first to South America, and then he came to North America, where he was at a monastery in Michigan. This was a man who had permanent dents all over his head from being struck with a rifle butt. And you think about what this man went through. Modern psychology, just pure logic, I think common sense would tell us that he should have come out of that experience a bitter, broken man, less than a human being, an animal, who was absolutely filled with depression, with PTSD, with resentment, with hatred, and yet he came out with utter peace. And he begins that 2-minute clip by saying, God bless the communists, because they put the priest in prison and the priest needs a little imprisonment. Eventually, I want to do a 3-part series, an hour each part, just talking about the brilliance of these 2 minutes. I think they say everything. I look at him and I say, I want to be that. I want to be someone who the world could come and try to break in every single way and be at complete peace. And the only way to become like him is to follow his method. I see this in 2,000 years of Christian history. I don't see the world producing the same results. I see the world making people more embittered, being more victimized, more depressed, more confused, more anxious. And I see the world holding people up and saying, these are victory stories. This is utter confusion. So no wonder we have an identity crisis. We don't know the God who created us. We refuse to know this God and follow his will, because so much of the world doesn't want to feel the guilt and shame that comes along with their sin. They want to be able to say, no, that sin is actually a good thing. It's an exalted thing. It should be followed. And therefore they don't have to examine their own conscience. And because of this, confusion has resulted. I'll say one last thing about this. Maybe we can talk about this more. Maybe we should cut this part out. Well, you decide. But I think that even if we're avoiding these ideologies, I think that just the rhythm of modern life is causing us to become more susceptible to this, because we're learning to be unfocused in everything. Social media has very much done this. Social media has caused us to enjoy constant distraction and to never settle for too long. I read recently that young adults and children are having more and more trouble watching movies from start to finish because they're so used to quick 10 to 30 second videos, swiping one after the other. We can't keep our attention. And so I think anything that calls us to have to look deep within ourselves is a little terrifying. And I think that there are many in charge who know that and are encouraging it.
In psychology, when you're introduced to an adverse idea or environment, if you're exposed to it long enough, so at first you reject it. You reject the idea. You say, I don't believe in this. I don't want to be a part of this. You have more exposure to it, then you begin to tolerate the idea or the environment. And then if you continue to have more exposure to it, meaning it's completely overwhelming, then you come to accept the idea. So I bring that up because how do we avoid capitulating on what the church is teaching versus what society is crashing down on us with? So let me give you an example. On Instagram and on Facebook, you can select your pronouns to publicly display. So this sends a message that our pronouns are malleable and they're our choice, because there's people that are selecting other pronouns that are not in accordance with who they are. They're putting they, them. They're putting he, she, it. They're putting, because you can choose. So you could be a he, she, or whatever. I mean, he, her. You can kind of pick and choose what you want to be. And the more this is in our face, even if you don't agree with it, we're kind of coming to accept it. Like, this is the new world. I think people forget that pronouns wasn't a thing, like, not that very long
10 minutes ago.
Yeah, exactly. So, but the more it's just so normal that you go to on your job application, what are your pronouns? Some employment places, your workplace, they require you to put it on your name tag. So now people are starting to think, oh, it's normal to publicly display our pronouns, which is not a normal thing, but it's become normal. How do we avoid capitulating on what the church teaches, even though we have all of this stuff that's brainwashing us?
Yeah. Things are changing so quickly. Things are changing so fast, it's hard to keep up with them. And I think you're absolutely right that new things are becoming normal that weren't normal just 5 mere minutes ago. And it's so hard to keep up with this because, again, I think we've been trained to have short memories on these things, so we forget that it was just 5-10 years ago that things weren't like this, that what is now not just normalized, but expected for you to support it, such that it feels abnormal if you don't. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, nobody thought whatsoever. We have to be able to take a step outside of those things and be able to examine them properly. But in order to examine them properly, we have to examine them from a perspective that is normal. And again, we aren't the author of what's normal. God is the author of what's normal. Christ is the example of normalcy par excellence. He's the one who gives us the image of what normal is. So the only way to normalize true normalcy in that sense is to do just as we're doing with society. And that's that we need to spend more time with that which is actually normal until it gets embedded within our hearts. It becomes part of the way that we think and breathe and speak. So there are two parts of this. One is shutting out the confusion of the world, and the other is embracing the normalcy of Christ. And we have to do both. For those who don't have, in a very practical sense, for those who don't yet have the strength and the courage to be able to just get rid of social media, to get rid of their TVs, to stop this constant yearning for entertainment, I would suggest that at the very least, just do that during the fast periods. We have 4 major fast periods of the church, and in some years 3. This year we have 3. There's no fast of Saints Peter and Paul this year because Pascha was so late. During those periods, fast not just from certain foods, but fast also from social media, fast from entertainment, fast from screens. And that may seem really strange and even terrifying at first. I've given this advice to teenagers who immediately just laughed, as if this was the most impossible thing in the world. I might as well have told them, let's go spend some time on the moon. This seemed impossible to them. So I said, well, why don't you just start with the first few days? And invariably, I've had people who have done this, who have said that they felt like for the first time in years, they were able to breathe. They were able to think straight. They were able to just kind of relax and not be driven by constant anxiety and constant FOMO, the fear of missing out. And they started to yearn for it. And they realized that there's actually opposing temptations. There's temptations for the confusion of this world, and there's temptations for the peace of Christ. And they ultimately had to fight that battle within their hearts and choose that peace of Christ. Then you want to make sure that you're fighting positively for Christ. And that means spending time in prayer. It means especially, I would argue, praying the Psalms and the Jesus prayer, doing at least 15 minutes a day and maybe more. And again, I know I make I give this advice constantly, but it'd be a good idea to go spend a week at a monastery. You would be shocked. You would be absolutely, if you've never done this before, you'd be shocked at how much 5 days at a monastery will utterly change you. Don't bring your phones, don't bring electronics, just live the life of the monks or the nuns. Find a good, healthy monastery, bring some spiritual reading. If they allow you to work with them, and just live this life for just a few days. 5 days is a great start. What ends up happening is you actually leave the monastery and go into the world, and immediately you start recognizing. This happened to me the first time I spent an extended time at a monastery. I immediately left and went home, and I turned on my TV because it was Friday night. And Friday night was, for those who are old enough to remember, TGIF. TGIF was, I don't know if it was ABC or whatever it was, but it had these sitcoms that were kind of the go-to TV. Then I turned on one of them, and I watched it for about 2-3 minutes. And I thought, there's nothing about this content that I could say is morally wrong. And yet it doesn't sit well with me. It's not resonating with what I just took from the monastery. You can think of it like tuning forks. My heart was vibrating at a certain resonance, and it was a beautiful resonance. The sound coming from it was like the truest me there is. And this was resonating at a very different frequency. And if you get two tuning forks that are at different frequencies and hold them together, you cringe. You say, oh, there's something wrong about this. Something felt wrong, and I immediately turned it off. And I think that was probably the first time where I had the thought, what should I do with my time? And instead of thinking, I'm going to go play a video game, I thought, I'm going to open my Bible. And I read a gospel. I'd never done that before. But that had become the new normal. Now, because I didn't constantly feed this, little by little, I reverted back to the worldly ways. But I always was able to look back at that and say, there was something about that was beautiful. I felt like life was beautiful in that moment, and I don't feel like modern living was, in a worldly sense, was beautiful. So eventually I was able to take that model and go back to it and recognize there was something really sweet about that, and I want to go back to that. So I think those are what we need to do. I think we need to first have a detox period. We need to go through a detox first, where we get rid of those things, and then we need to go to the things that are the most true, the most beautiful, the things that are truly good in the transcendent ideal, and we need to spend time with those. And if you can't go to a monastery, then what you do is you read. You read the lives of modern saints and elders and read the Gospels. You fast and you pray. And the more you do this, the more you're going to realize that all the things of this world that are happening are just ways of distracting your heart and lying to you and saying that these will actually fulfill your heart. This, by the way, is the lie of the devil. That what the devil does is it says, I know what your heart is yearning for, and I'm going to offer it something, and this is going to make you feel fulfilled. You're actually going to be fulfilled when you get the new phone, when you spend time on social media doing this, when you post this, when you get this new music album, whatever it is, you're going to feel fulfilled. And then you acquire those things, you consume them, and after a few minutes or days, whatever it takes, you go, oh, that yearning is back. This must have not fulfilled. And then the devil comes and says, oh, well, maybe that didn't fulfill you, but this will. So take some of this. And it just happens again and again and again and again and again. Well, why is it that growing up, I'd get a new music album, my favorite band, and I'd listen to it and I'd go, oh my goodness, this is so good. I don't feel like I'm ever going to need any more music. This is it. And then you listen to it for the 20th or 40th or 100th time, and suddenly you go, I'm bored of it. I'm bored of it. It's because nothing like that will ever fulfill the deepest yearnings of our heart. And this is all the world does, is it takes the yearnings of our heart and it fills it in false ways with lies. And then when we expose the lie, it says, no, but now I'll do it. How many times is it going to take before we realize this is never going to work? I don't want to live my life with these fleeting lies, constantly seeking after the next thing, after the next fulfillment. When I feel so empty, I feel broken, I feel completely alienated inside. But it's interesting that the divine liturgy never feels that way. No one ever goes, I've done the liturgy a couple hundred times now and I'm just bored of it now. It always feels living because it's always fulfilling that deepest yearning of our heart. It's meeting the heart in the sense that the heart actually yearns for eternal things, for those transcendence of eternal beauty, goodness, and truth. Only Christ can do it. Does that take a difficult decision? Yeah, you have to be crucified to this world. And that's a tough thing. It's admittedly not an easy thing because we are addicted to the things of this world. And we hold on to them like a security blanket. We're so used to them. And we think that our life is going to be more depressing without them. You can think of this in terms of, which one last idea, but I'm in the process in my household of doing a big decluttering. We're just getting rid of as much stuff as possible. And what's interesting is when you get rid of these things, when you first look at that box full of the stuff that you've had for so long, you go, oh my goodness, life is going to somehow feel lacking without these things. But then you take them and you throw them out, and you walk into the room without them, and you go, there's a new piece here. This is what we need to do with the heart. The heart is cluttered with all the things of this world, all the constant noise. We need to declutter the heart so that there's room for Christ. And then when Christ is there, Metroban Harotheus Vlachos says, he says, when you take prayer, the Jesus prayer, and fasting, you meld them together and you make a drill, and you drill down to the heart, and you drill deeper and deeper and deeper until finally you find an altar there with a candle lit, and the Holy Spirit prays the liturgy within your heart. That's something you can't take away from someone, no matter what. That's what will fulfill man. So these are what's needed. We need to detox, we need to declutter the heart from the things of this world, and then fill it with the proper things, and then we will have the proper perspective and be able to see the world and examine it without it becoming such a threat that we immediately just embrace all this falseness around us.
How do we effectively show love to people that are lost? You know, they're coming from a transgender background or a homosexual background. Oftentimes, it sounds kind of like when Christians say, "Oh, I'm being hard on you because I love you." I feel like sometimes Christians say that as an excuse just to be mean, and they don't truly love them. How do we truly extend the olive branch and say, "Hey, look, I'm going to be firm in what the church teaches and in what I believe, you know, because of the church, but I'm going to love you. So I'm not going to accept your position that you hold, but I'm going to extend the olive branch, and I want to show you love, and I want you to know that you are loved and you are worthy of love."
Yeah, sure. We have to recognize that the world is trying to offer love without truth, and we often make the mistake of offering truth without love. Love without truth is not really love. Objectively, it's not love. It's a false love. It's a distortion, and often it works against true love. Truth without love is ineffective, and sometimes it's just plain counterproductive. It actually drives people away. So we need to have a proper balance here, which means first and foremost, we have to be living it. If we're not living it, who are we to speak on others when we can't even follow truth and love in ourselves and our own lives? So first, we must live it. Secondly, we need to make a distinction between the purveyors of demonic ideologies and the victims. And the victims often become the cheerleaders. They become purveyors in their own right, but they don't fully know what they're doing. They're not intentionally leading people astray. It's because they've been given this false notion of love, and they're trying the best they can to act on that love without realizing that it's a distortion, that it's false. So I think when we come across someone who's struggling with these things, the first thing we need to recognize is that their heart yearns for the same things our hearts yearn for. And they've been given a false bill of sale. They've been given a bunch of lies that are cloaked in truth, in the language of truth, that are cloaked in the language of mercy and love. And their hearts are still yearning for true goodness and true beauty and true truth. Their hearts are still yearning for good things, but they've been misled. And so the first thing we have to recognize is that deep down, there is still a person made in the image of God there. There's still a person made in the image of God, and whether they realize it or not, they're actually seeking the likeness of God. They just don't know how yet. And for that reason, I think that we can go in with a little bit of a softer approach with most. Then we have to listen. We have to listen, and we have to help people, I think, explore what their heart is really yearning for. We also have to know with a great deal of wisdom when to speak and when not to speak. There are plenty of people who they're too steeply embedded. They're too deeply embedded with a lot of this ideology that they can't properly hear yet. And we have to know that sometimes those discussions are going to just descend into arguments, and that's not going to be very helpful. And then we have to understand that the best thing we can do is, rather than tell them everything that's wrong with their perspective, because when you're deeply embedded in a perspective, it's very hard to see from a different perspective. It's hard to get yourself out of that. It's better simply to show them the light and beauty and truth of Orthodoxy. And I think that the more we show them the glory and beauty of the Christian faith, the more it becomes an attraction. Now, all this assumes something that I think people forget all too readily today, that the goal is not to change them in the moment. The goal is to plant some seeds. The best thing you can do is plant some seeds. And I have had plenty of people come to the faith after hearing something that did not resonate with them in the moment, or seeing something that meant nothing to them in the moment. And years later, it awoke in them. Then they were ready to hear it. And they came to the church. I'll say one last thing about personal experience with this. We have had in this parish, and I know plenty of other priests who have had others in their parishes come, who entered the parish at the tail end of them embracing the radical sexual and gender ideologies of today. We've had people in this parish who came in as transgender. And in every single case that I know of, those who have detransitioned, those who have sought Christ in repentance, have said that indeed Christ is what they were actually yearning for in the first place. They have openly said that they are resentful of the ideology that was presented to them, that had they never been presented with transgenderism as an option to begin with, they would have never even considered it. And they almost wish they'd lived in a time when that was never an option to begin with. They're embittered by those who intentionally ignored and pushed aside all the negative consequences of embracing this ideology and embracing this lifestyle. But they were able to find peace with Christ. And that, I think, is a proof that what the hearts yearn for all along is Christ, which means that if we're going to present Christ to them, we better present Christ in a way where he seems desirable. And if we approach things in a way that make Christ undesirable, that make Christ seem overbearing and angry and embittered, we have not done our job. We have done a disservice to the gospel. And before we correct others, we need to look in the mirror and correct ourselves.